The end of World War II marked the cessation of active combat, but the war's legacy continued in unexpected ways. For the Allies, the fate of the German prison camps became a pressing issue. These camps, built to house millions of prisoners of war, POWs, during the conflict, had outlived their original purpose with the German surrender in May 1945. But what became of these sprawling complexes, once symbols of wartime captivity, once the need for them dissipated? The question of their future was complex, shaped by economic constraints, shifting priorities, and the weight of history itself. At the close of hostilities, the Allies faced a world in ruins. The destruction of cities, the decimation of infrastructure, and the psychological toll on populations created a grim environment for all nations involved. Resources were scarce. The economy of Europe was strained, its priorities elsewhere. The question of what to do with the remnants of the war machine, including the POW camps, loomed large. These facilities, built for mass internment, were no longer needed for their original function. But they were far from empty. Some camps were already housing large numbers of German POWs, while others had been repurposed to shelter displaced persons, including civilians from the Eastern Bloc, Jews, and former Axis soldiers. The prospect of abandoning these camps to deteriorate was an unthinkable option for a continent desperate to rebuild. In the immediate aftermath, the Allies, primarily the United States, the United Kingdom, and France, found themselves responsible for managing these sites. Early decisions varied widely, influenced by geography, political considerations, and the military priorities of the occupying powers. As many as 5 million German soldiers had been captured by Allied forces. In addition, there were millions of civilians displaced by the war, many of whom were housed in makeshift camps, some of which had been hastily constructed within the confines of the former prison complexes. Among the Allies, there was a pressing need to secure these camps to prevent unrest and ensure basic living conditions for the internees. But the larger question, what to do with the camps long-term, remained unresolved. In the immediate months after the war, the conditions of these camps varied widely. In some areas, especially in France and Italy, the former German POW camps were dismantled or repurposed quickly for housing displaced persons, including Holocaust survivors. The United States, with its significant military presence in Germany, found that some camps had already been transformed into temporary barracks for American soldiers. However, as early as mid-1946, the vast scale of the former POW infrastructure began to emerge as a significant logistical burden. Despite the pressing need for resources elsewhere, the cost of maintaining and securing these camps became unsustainable. Thousands of men, women, and children had found temporary refuge in them, but few were equipped to stay there long-term. The camps were overcrowded and poorly equipped, with shortages of food, medical supplies, and shelter. The Allied forces had to grapple with the task of maintaining order within the camps, where tensions between displaced persons and former POWs often flared. Worse, the local populations of Germany, having suffered immense hardship during the war, were often reluctant to assist or even accept the return of millions of their own citizens, let alone foreign nationals. Compounding this challenge was the fact that, for many of the former German POWs, the war was not yet truly over. The notion of repatriation was fraught with difficulty. Repatriation of prisoners, particularly those from the Soviet Union, was a contentious issue. While many German soldiers were sent back to their homeland, others, those from nations under Soviet control, faced years of forced labor or detention in Soviet camps, a fate often considered as harsh as their time in the Allied camps. The question of their treatment by the Allies was complex, politically charged, and deeply entwined with the broader geopolitical landscape of post-war Europe. The camps themselves had been originally built for specific purposes, tailored to the needs of wartime internment. Some were designed for large-scale confinement, while others had been built for more specialized roles. The architectural and logistical considerations of these facilities were soon seen as inadequate for any future use. Most had been hastily constructed and were poorly equipped to withstand the long-term challenges posed by their new role as detention centers for civilian populations. In some instances, the very geography of these camps, many of them located in remote parts of Europe, made them unsuitable for anything but temporary housing. In 1946, the Allied powers began to prioritize the dismantling of these prison camps, but the process was neither simple nor swift. Several camps, such as Stalag 13C in Bavaria, housed tens of thousands of displaced persons for a significant period after the war. Yet, even as early as 1947, many camps that had initially been filled with prisoners of war were being abandoned, their operations increasingly scaled back. At the same time, a significant number of these camps were being repurposed for new uses, most notably as holding areas for German citizens or other displaced populations who were returning home. Not all of these camps were abandoned outright. Some were converted into military installations, where former POW barracks were refashioned into barracks for the German Bundeswehr, the newly established West German military. Others saw a more mixed fate. They were converted into civilian housing complexes, schools, or industrial sites. However, these new purposes were often a challenge to implement, as the camps had been built for mass internment, not habitation. In many cases, entire sections of the camps were simply left to fall into disrepair. Meanwhile, Allied governments had to make tough decisions about how to deal with the significant backlog of prisoners and displaced persons. The Soviet Union, particularly, had its own policies regarding the repatriation of German prisoners. In the late 1940s, tens of thousands of German POWs were still held in the Soviet Union under what was called forced repatriation. The Soviet Union's treatment of prisoners was harsh, and many German soldiers faced further years of forced labor. Western Allied powers, on the other hand, were eager to repatriate their prisoners and return the camps to civilian use. By the early 1950s, however, the demand for large, wartime internment camps had passed. Even as the camps gradually emptied, many were left to deteriorate. The logistical challenges of dismantling or repurposing the facilities were enormous, compounded by the economic realities of post-war Europe. Dismantling a single camp could take years, especially as much of the necessary materials had been redirected to rebuilding efforts elsewhere. These camps, now symbols of a world that had been shattered, were slowly erased from memory. By the late 1950s, few traces of them remained, and the vast majority had either been repurposed, demolished, or abandoned altogether. But there was no single, unified fate for the thousands of wartime prison camps scattered across Europe. They experienced an array of outcomes. Some dissolved into the post-war landscape, while others lingered on as historical reminders. The process of dismantling or converting the camps was slow and labor-intensive. Many sites had no lasting memorials, their once great significance fading into the obscurity of the Cold War era. In the years following World War II, the fate of the Allied prison camps continued to evolve, shaped by the broader geopolitical and economic realities of the post-war world. The dismantling of these camps and their eventual repurposing or abandonment was not a straightforward process. It was instead a complex series of decisions driven by necessity, scarce resources, and changing political landscapes. As the years passed, the post-war climate of Europe shifted from Reconstruction to the Cold War, and the need to preserve or repurpose the remnants of wartime infrastructure gradually gave way to the demands of national recovery and the emerging conflict between East and West. The first significant trend after the immediate post-war years was the conversion of a number of these camps into temporary housing for displaced persons, DPs. The term displaced persons referred to those who had been uprooted from their homes during the war, whether through forced labor, deportation, or the consequences of territorial shifts in the wake of the war's end. Among the displaced were millions of ethnic Germans, many of whom had been expelled from Eastern Europe following the war, as well as Jewish refugees, former POWs, and other civilians from territories occupied by the Axis powers. These displaced populations, in many cases, had nowhere to go but the camps that had once been used for the confinement of soldiers. In the Soviet zone of occupation, the situation was especially dire. The Soviet Union had maintained a strict and brutal policy regarding its own POWs. In stark contrast to the Western Allies, the Soviets retained large numbers of German soldiers well into the late 1940s, subjecting many to years of forced labor in Siberia. For those who were not repatriated immediately, life in the Soviet camps was marked by deprivation, forced labor, and harsh treatment. Many of the prisoners who had been captured on the Eastern Front were used as slave labor to rebuild Soviet industry, contributing to the construction of infrastructure in the Soviet Union. In the American, British, and French zones, the process of repatriation was somewhat more straightforward. By the end of 1947, most of the POWs held by the Western Allies had been sent back to Germany, although this process took several years to fully complete, particularly for soldiers from the Soviet occupation zone. Still, despite the pressure to clear the camps, they remained crowded with displaced persons. As these camps became more focused on housing refugees, many former POWs were left in limbo, unsure of where to go or how to reintegrate into the fractured societies from which they had come. The camps that were not immediately repurposed as housing centers or military installations began to face the daunting reality of obsolescence. Some, located in rural or remote areas of Europe, were simply abandoned to the elements, their structures left to decay. Over time, as the economic situation in Europe slowly improved, there was little incentive to preserve these sites. The focus had shifted to rebuilding cities, restoring agriculture, and re-establishing industries, and the prisons, many of which were poorly constructed in the first place, were seen as vestiges of a grim past. This period of neglect and abandonment stretched into the 1950s. By then, the most significant remnants of the prison camp system were largely gone or converted into new uses. Some camps that had once been massive sites for holding POWs had been transformed into industrial hubs. The sheer scale of some of the camps, with their extensive infrastructure, meant that in many cases, portions of the camps could be adapted for civilian purposes. However, the process of converting these sites was fraught with challenges, not only due to the poor condition of the camp structures but also because the task was often at odds with the priorities of economic recovery. The camp's locations, which had been chosen for reasons of isolation and security during the war, were not always ideal for repurposing in the post-war years. The nearby regions were often either economically depressed or still in the midst of reconstruction, making it difficult to invest heavily in what was, at best, a secondary priority. In some cases, former POW camps were used as bases for NATO operations during the early years of the Cold War. Sites such as Stalag 13C in Germany, which had housed tens of thousands of prisoners during the war, were re-established as military posts, sometimes housing foreign troops stationed in West Germany. This transition reflected the changing security priorities of the 1950s, when Europe's attention was focused on the emerging threat of Soviet expansion. The shift from prisoner camps to military installations was a pragmatic solution, one that made use of the camp's existing infrastructure and large-scale facilities. But this transition was not without controversy, as former prisoners of war and displaced persons had their own memories of suffering and exploitation in these camps. The decision to maintain such facilities for military purposes raised questions about the legacy of wartime internment and the ethics of using these sites to house armed forces so soon after the end of the war. As the Cold War intensified, many former prison camps began to be repurposed for civilian use. In some cases, the Allied powers allowed the German government to take control of these sites and use them for housing or industrial purposes. The rapid expansion of the West German economy in the 1950s and 1960s allowed for the conversion of these once vast complexes into thriving industrial zones. This process, while a sign of economic recovery, also symbolized the broader changes in the German political landscape. The country's shift from a defeated Axis power to a key member of the Western Bloc highlighted the remarkable transformation that occurred in the post-war period. However, the repurposing of the camps was not without its moral and social implications. Many of the sites were located in areas that had been heavily bombed during the war and were still in a state of disrepair. The process of conversion often involved demolishing sections of the camp or modifying existing structures, which in some cases meant erasing the historical memory of the sites. For the many survivors of the camps, the sight of these former sites being transformed into factories, military bases, or housing developments was a difficult one. Yet for most of Europe, the priority was recovery, and the past, particularly the horrors of the war and the camps, was often seen as something best left behind in the interests of moving forward. By the 1960s, The majority of the camps had either been repurposed, abandoned, or demolished. Some remained as relics of the past, with only a few remnants of their former use still visible. In some instances, the memory of these sites faded completely as new generations of Europeans focused on rebuilding and reintegrating into the modern world. A few camps, however, were preserved as historical sites, serving as somber reminders of the war's cost. These memorials were particularly important as the war receded into history, and a new generation of Europeans began to confront the legacies of the past, including the dark chapter of forced internment and the civilian suffering that had taken place in these camps. Yet, for all the repurposing and transformation of these camps, the legacy of their existence continued to reverberate through the decades. The question of how Europe would remember the war, and particularly the camps, was one that would not be fully answered until later. By the late 20th century, efforts to preserve and commemorate the memories of those who had suffered in these camps grew stronger, culminating in the establishment of memorials, museums, and educational initiatives dedicated to preserving the history of wartime internment. These efforts were, in part, a response to the gradual erasure of the physical sites, and in part, a recognition that the history of the camps, and the millions who had passed through them, was too important to be forgotten.